Thank you. So, writing about the youth in Nazi Germany in 1937, Edward Kunze discussed the success of the Nazi policy towards the young, in that there had been a radical transformation of the German youth and Hitler deserved the credit. He concluded by raising concerns about the influence of the Nazis, stating that the youth was a pawn in the hands of angry gods. Now, in the game of chess, there are more pawns than other pieces, and their use in the game is often misinterpreted as a weak game piece and can be sacrificed to win. Kunze could be implying that children had no control under the Nazis, were malleable and could be used indiscriminately for the good of the nation. However, when used strategically in the game of chess, pawns can provide strength equal to the queen. Therefore, the youth needed to support the Nazi ideology as they were considered the backbone to Nazi society, hence Hitler stating, "Whoever had the youth has the future." Now, Kunze would not have been able to foresee the forms of youth opposition to the Nazis in groups such as the Edelweiss Pirates or Swing Youth, or that attendance to the Hitler Youth would become compulsory in 1939, demonstrating the Nazis did not have total control over a seemingly subservient youth. However, post-World War II, the rebellious and non-conforming side of the youth is rarely seen. Books and films continue to show Nazi youth policy was a success, and there was loyal support to Hitler, as demonstrated in documentaries such as the 2017 Hitler Youth and the 2020 Taika Waititi film Jojo Rabbit. Jojo Rabbit, through humour, shows the indoctrination of the youth, that they proudly wore their Hitler uniform and believed Jews were monsters. However, in the last scene, which shows the Nazis defeated, the audience sees Jojo not wearing his Hitler Youth uniform, dressed in normal clothes for a child, dancing with Elsa, the Jewish girl Jojo's mother had been hiding. Waititi has given Jojo's character agency, in that the story of his childhood of indoctrination has ended with his realisation he has been lied to and he's now gained freedom from the Nazi regime. Now, this scene made me wonder, why do we not hear about these stories of German juveniles who didn't conform or fit in with the Nazi ideal? Now, these juveniles did not include those in opposition groups, but juveniles who engaged in behaviour unbecoming of the young Nazi community, such as having relations with the wrong group of people, staying out past their curfew, drinking and smoking. Juveniles were detained in camps for disruptive crimes such as these, and again, they are referred to as asocials. But information about this group, particularly in English, is very limited. Now, is this because there's been a lack of research resulting in this group of juveniles being left out of the historiography, or because there's a lack of interest or audience, hence the lack of historiography? Now, these two questions work in tandem, as research can ignite interest, but interest can also ignite research. Could this lack of discussion also reflect an unease about continued negative attitudes or stereotypes of juveniles being disruptive and asocial members of society? Disruptive and unruly youths were not unique to the Nazis, nor was government action to control their behaviour. So has the historic and continued concern about juvenile delinquency made the recognition of asocial juveniles as victims of Nazi persecution problematic, resulting in their exclusion from post-war remembrance or reparations? It is this last question I'll be exploring today by looking at what an asocial juvenile in Germany was, how they were treated in the protection camps, and how this has impacted on the recognition of juvenile asocials as a group persecuted by the Nazis. So let us first consider who was an asocial. So the term asocial is really problematic because of its vagueness of meaning and historic criminal use. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, asocial means not social, antagonistic to society or social order, basically people who are not compatible with the mainstream society. Antisocial is defined as actively averse to society and opposed to principles on which society is constructed. These are vague definitions and often interchanged, and, as Lisa Pine suggests, are elastic. They are open to interpretation and manipulation based on cultures and communities. The Nazis used and adapted the term to suit their societal goals. And as per the Nazis, my term asocial incorporates both antisocial and asocial traits that oppose the Nazi society. So can juvenile actions really be considered asocial? Jeremy Noakes has explored that those considered social outcasts in Nazi Germany states that asocials were individuals who were socially and productively inefficient. This can only relate to this relates to adult asocials, but can it really be applied to juveniles? Noakes does not specify if this term is age-specific, implying that either juveniles cannot be categorised as asocials or that it is a term not dependent on age. Juveniles are often stereotyped as naturally rebellious because as they develop, they express a range of emotions due to brain development during puberty or hormonal changes, which in some cases could be unfairly considered asocial traits. So what other factors might make them asocial? In Germany, male juvenile asocials could be detained for general demoralisation, such as roaming the city and staying out past their curfew. Female juvenile asocials were detained for moral offences such as sexual deviance, which was the same as female adult asocials. These are all traits that historically have been and still are regarded as socially unacceptable. The Nazis criminalised this behaviour to a point that juvenile asocials, were targeted for incarceration into camps. Though people with asocial traits today are not removed from society, they are shunned and vilified. And if we add the stereotype of a rebellious teenager, this could provide some reasoning as to why there has been a lack of attention towards this group. So why were the Nazis concerned about juvenile asocials? The Nazis had only been in power for 6 years when at a conference on the degenerate youth in December 1939, Reinhard Heydrich demanded the establishment of reform camps. The fact there was a conference focusing on the degenerate youth implies there was a real concern that the naturally rebellious nature of teenagers was working in opposition to the Nazi policy. This conference resulted in the Nazis establishing the Reich Centre for Combating Youth Criminality to monitor behaviours and 3 inappropriately named youth protection camps. However, prior to the camp's formation, the Nazis had already concluded that asocials could not be reformed through their early attempts with asocial family colonies. Therefore, groups of asocial juveniles were placed into camps not for protection or rehabilitation, but to protect members of the community that were either actively or passively conforming to the Nazi policies. These camps did not reform the juveniles for a return to society, as few left the camps for a life of freedom. The few juvenile males that were released were sent to the RAD or army, and girls were often sent to work for the SS in nurseries. So establishing 3 juvenile camps demonstrates asocial juveniles were targeted by the Nazis. So why has there been such limited attention, and particularly in English, towards this group? One answer to this question could be social class, as asocials in Nazi Germany tended to be people from low social mobility, non-traditional or broken families. At the age of 10, Maria Portziba was orphaned. 3 years later, in 1941, she was arrested for sexual intercourse with a Polish forced labourer and sent to the Uckermark Youth Protection Camp. Maria does not discuss her family's social status or who took care of her after her parents' death, but she does state she had 10 siblings and came from a very large family that were trying to support each other. Municipal authorities in Germany had raised concerns about the cost of benefits towards asocials. Therefore, removing them to camps transferred the cost and the problem of asocials to the state. Currently, there's no documentation suggesting that Maria and her family had been receiving welfare benefits, but she was not in a traditional family setting, and had she been in a receipt of benefits, would have been considered a possible delinquent. The Nazis believed asocials were connected to the family setting, therefore hereditary. Today, juvenile asocial traits still have that connection to the family setting, but not because of hereditary factors, but because of the connection to income and welfare benefits. Another reason for the lack of research may relate to the implication that female asocials had in relation to the connection of crime of a sexual nature. There is a complexity with sex and victims of the Nazis, as the majority of sexual acts were violent and non-consensual. However, some sexual acts were performed as a method of barter. There is a lack of recognition of female agency regarding the use of their bodies, which is reflected in the problematic nature of sex and women, not only in the Third Reich, but also the Western world. This relates to adults and becomes far more complex when we talk about juveniles. The Nazis portrayed themselves as moral crusaders, cleaning up society, along with teenagers detained for open opposition to the Nazis. There were also juveniles detained for sexual deviance, which the Nazis implied was having a number of partners. Now, sexual activity in Nazi Germany was of a contradictory nature. Sex was taught with a focus on eugenics and the importance of finding the ideal partner. In attempting to create a morally strong and healthy youth, the Nazis removed teenage rebellious years and converted them into adults before they were emotionally and socially ready. Girls were taught their role in society was to be a mother or carer, and essentially her body belonged to the state. Sex had been reduced to a biological function, and fresh, clean German air became the substitute for sex education. Now, the Nazis weren't promoting promiscuity, but the League of German Maidens provided girls with the opportunity to escape the family home and parental scrutiny. And this may have allowed some to engage in natural teenage rebellious actions. But there were still a number of girls who were criminalised, incarcerated for sexual deviancy. Therefore, female asocial juveniles in concentration camps were often perceived as sexual deviants. The discussion of sex and concentration camps is mostly linked with sexual violence and in some testimony from survivors, a form of coercion. Camps were places of extreme violence and sexual assault and rape did take place, but so did consensual acts, either for barter or as a natural emotional act. There were some female juveniles in the camp who used sexual activity for flirting or to gain a sense of agency over their situation in the camps, though I do not suggest this was a method the inmates preferred. Giving agency to men and women in the camps who engaged in sexual activity through a choice challenges the reader. As we learn about the horrors and inhumane conditions, it makes it impossible to imagine a place where an intimate act could be used willingly for even emotional barter. By continually connecting any form of sexual act to violence in the camps implies those engaged in it willingly lacked morals and were vilified. And this takes away victim agency. Some women and female juveniles chose to engage in sexual activity to better their chances of survival or feel human in a place that strips them of humanity. But the problem here is we are talking about juveniles. Further complicating this fact is the fact that some girls may have been used in camp brothels. Women were selected for forced sex labour in brothels, aged generally between 17 and 45. However, juveniles may also have been used, as is unlikely the SS set a minimum age. Ravensbrück camp provided forced sex labourers to brothels, and Uckermark Youth Protection Camp was connected to Ravensbrück. Therefore, potentially asocials from the juvenile subcamp were used in camp brothels, and this is an area I will be pursuing in my research. A further reason for the lack of research is that female asocials in concentration camps challenge that perception of an inmate support system. Testimony demonstrates support networks, either from family members or friends, old and new, were a vital resource in order to prolong survival because food was shared and there was a chance that you might get a more favourable work detail in the camps. Survivor accounts often use the collective term of we, therefore providing the reader with the assumption that the inmates were united and helped each other. In the most horrible and dangerous of places, the reader is reassured that the inmates were not reduced to a survival of the fitness mentality, and the Nazis were unable to remove a basic sense of humanity amongst them. Myrna Goldberg and Margaret Hutton summarise that socialisation and friendships were an important contribution to survival, emphasising that this was more prominent amongst females, that there was solidarity and essentially a sisterhood in the camp. Now, Goldenberg and Hutton are correct that a sisterhood can be found. However, the concept of a sisterhood is problematic as it provides an image of girls supporting and helping each other, whatever their status or crime. However, to date, my research has found that there are support networks amongst groups such as the political inmates. However, support was not offered outside of their criminal group, as it were. Additionally, survivor testimony states that asocials were untrustworthy and could not form their own homogenous group. This may have been because their crime was so vague and the only uniting feature was their black triangle. The concept of a sisterhood should have united all women. However, asocials entered the camp at a disadvantage as their social group had been vilified long before their incarceration, which is also mirrored in survivor testimony. Now, what were the conditions like in these youth protection camps? The conditions in these camps replicate those in the adults, that food was scarce, punishments were severe, and sleeping conditions were poor and the work detail was harsh. A letter sent by a factory owner in 1940 raised concerns about the minimum level of work that was to be achieved by the youths from the concentration camp. They needed a satisfactory diet, indicating that the young teenagers were not receiving enough food. Severe punishments of having to stand for hours on end, solitary confinement for up to 3 weeks with limited food have been reported. And in Uckermark, Hilda Lazak recalls 3 girls hanging from gallows as a reminder of the consequences for those not following orders, therefore demonstrating capital punishment was enacted. Though a report from Moragan youth camps suggests there were educators, there was no educational plan. That essentially these camps had become a place to hide the asocial youth, and they could now be utilised as part of the concentration camp workforce. The youth had been claimed by Hitler and could now be easily disregarded. So why is there this limited discussion of the juvenile asocials, despite these camps being formed? Catherine Braun states that the policies of historic justice are performative acts that inevitably link the past, present and future in specific ways, and that until an approach occurs, a clear break with injustices of the past cannot happen. Though the German Bundestag officially recognised asocials as a persecuted group by the Nazis in 2020, the time taken for this to happen and the limited attention towards this group is still reflective of a discomfort or a reluctance to explore this group, as their status is still regarded as a social crime or as an outcast today, therefore reducing their victim status. Life in post-World War Germany would have further complicated attitudes towards asocial juveniles as victims of the Nazis. Herschel Alt, a specialist in mental health and child welfare, in 1949 raised a concern that there was now a higher rate of delinquency amongst German youth than before the war and in other countries, which he said constitutes an immediate social problem. However, juvenile unrest and delinquency after World War II was not unsurprising. A war had ended, Nazi crimes were being discussed. At Yalta and Potsdam, Germany was being temporarily separated and overseen by an allied foreign power. Children have been significantly disrupted during World War II, and in the subsequent post-war period, through factors such as an inconsistent education and a post-war recovery in a divided Germany, adults' fears were really increasing about juveniles. Cultural changes would have also been a factor. There was a growing consumer and music influence, particularly from America, in a post-war Europe that concerned adults from both East and West Germany, that it was heralding a dangerous breakdown in order and obedience. In 1953, a prominent mathematics professor, Wilhelm Sturm, stated that to save money on the educatable asocials, they needed to be placed in special institutions. Now, these all provide some reasoning as to why the youth protection camps in the 1950s and 60s were not categorised as a concentration camp, because they were actually viewed as a positive example of dealing with asocial youths. The discussion on how to solve the problem of juvenile delinquents continues, and based on the number of journals available exploring this issue, demonstrates it's a worldwide problem. Perhaps it's society's fear of juvenile delinquency and crime that has delayed in acknowledging youth protection camps as being the same as concentration camps. The majority of juvenile asocials were essentially being different to what was expected in German society, who at the time was either following actively or passively Nazi social norms. Now, my research is only in its second year. However, it's opened up a variety of research paths, such as survivor guilt, the use of sexual agency by women, which resulted in the perception they were not a victim of Nazi persecution. Joan Ringelheim states that we avoid listening to stories we do not want to hear, and that the result is specific memories are not explored, resulting in significant information gaps. In relation to asocials, juvenile asocials, their story has not been avoided, it's been neglected and stereotypes reinforced. So I'll end my exploration by drawing your attention once again to Maria, the asocial juvenile previously discussed. She was arrested in 1941, having incorrectly been accused of sexual relations with a Polish forced labourer. She was sent to Uckermark and remained there until October 1944, where she was forced to work in an SS children's home. I've yet to find out more information about her experiences in camp, but there is information about her experiences after the war ended. When she returned home to her home village, she was attacked by the villagers. She was referred to as the Poles' whore. Family members also excluded her from events. Now, these actions demonstrate that Maria was not seen as a victim. She was still seen as being guilty of a social crime and being forced out of a community that she had grown up in. Her experiences demonstrate that her story was not avoided, it has been neglected and, in a sense, silenced. And this is the case with other asocial juvenile survivors. I hope my research is going to bridge that gap for juvenile asocials and open up a discussion into why their experiences have been neglected for so long. Thank you.